This video I'm going to discuss chord positions and different systems of analysis. We're going to start with something called inversion, chord inversion. And this is the idea behind inversion. This is an F major chord. An F major chord is made up of an F, an A, and a C. This is also an F major chord with some pretty large differences. First, the notes are not so close together, plus there's a different note in the bottom. It's a C, but still we have all three members present. The F, the A, and the C, they're just kind of jumbled up. What about this? Here we have an F, a C, and an A, still an F major chord, only we don't have all the notes exactly in order, F, A, C, but all of them are present. As long as all of the members of the chord are present, this is still an F major chord. All of these are F major chords. This chord, first one, is in root position. Root position indicates that the root is the bass note. We already know what a root is. It's what gives the chord its name. An F major chord has F as its root. An F major chord does not necessarily always have F as its bass, though. And this is bass, not bass. Don't make that mistake. The bass, this is a very simple definition. It's the lowest sounding pitch in a chord. So in this chord, it happens to be that both the root and the bass are the same. If the root and the bass are the same, the chord is in root position. This chord is also in root position. Even though it's jumbled, the root and the bass are still the same. The only aspects of the chord which make it root position are if the root and the bass are the same. And both of these are share that characteristic. In this chord, it's still an F major chord, but there's a C in the bass this time. So the root is not in the bass. This is not root position. This is what's called an inversion. So I'm going to erase everything else. Let's take a look at some inversions. I'm going to leave that one, but I'm going to put another one in front of it. Let's do this. Okay, both of those are F major chords. In this chord, the third is the bass. Therefore, it is not in root position. A chord that is not in root position is inverted. So anything that's not root position is considered an inversion. An inversion is just putting a different member of the chord in the bass. The root is always going to be the same. If it's an F major chord, F will always be the root. The bass is the lowest note. The root is the name of the chord, or what gives the chord its name. So this one has the third in the bass. This chord has the fifth in the bass. So both of these are inversions. They have different chord members in the bass. These are both triads. We're only going to start with triads for now. Then we'll add sevenths in a bit. If you have a triad with a third in the bass, this is referred to as first inversion. This is second inversion, if the fifth is in the bass. So there's only three positions for a triad: root position, first inversion, or second inversion. So if you have an assignment where you're given triads, the notes from a triad, and you have to determine which inversion these triads are in, this is how you do it. First, you need to figure out what the root is. There's a few different ways of doing this. I'm going to show you one way, maybe a couple of other ways. And I encourage you to do some experimentation, see if you can come up with a way to do this. There's always, almost always, more than one way to come up with the correct solution. Everybody thinks in a different way, so figure out what works the best for you and do that. So I'm going to show you what works for me. We have in this triad an E, a C, and a G. Hopefully, eventually, especially by the end of the semester, you'll be able to look at that at sight. Some of you may be able to right now, and just immediately be able to recognize what the root is. But for those of us who cannot, let's do the work. Let's figure it out. There's only 3 arrangements for these notes to be in, because there's only 3 notes. So we have the E on the bottom at this point, and I'm going to, over here, just condense everything. And I'm going to put the E on the bottom of a triad and keep the same notes in it, E, G, and C. And the reason I put the G next is I put the E on the bottom and I crunched the notes as close as possible. So I put them in very close position. You notice when I put these in this sort of position, I don't change any of the notes, I just compact them. There's a gap. If there's a gap, that indicates it's not in root position. I'm going to rearrange the notes then. I'm going to try, and I'm just doing this for imagination purposes, just to look at the spacings of the notes. I'm going to put the G in the bass. The G's not in the bass, but I'm going to imagine that it's in the bass. If I have a G in the bass and I put these notes as close together as I can, I still have that gap between G and C. If I put the C on the bottom, I don't have a gap. That's the only arrangement of these in close position where there's no gap. Once you found your positioning without a gap, you have found the root of the chord. So once you have built your snowman, you have your root. So find your snowman and you find your root. That means the root of this chord is C. This is some sort of a C. Now hopefully you have enough experience by this point to be able to recognize that that's a C major triad. We've already discussed quality and how to spell triads, so I'm just going to hopefully assume that you know that. We have figured out the root. This is a C major triad with an E in the bass. The E is the third, so that means that this is a C major triad in first inversion. You notice that the root is not in the bass. That's because it's an inverted triad. Let's try another one of these. We'll go a little bit faster this time. We have 4 notes. Let's figure out what they are first. There's an F, there's a B flat, there's a D, and another F. Because the F is just doubling, I don't have to worry about the second one. These are the only pitches which are represented in this chord. F, B flat, and D. Let's try to build a snowman, starting with F. F, and the next note that would be here in this triad would be B flat. D, that's not in root position because there's a gap. If I put the B flat in the bottom, there is no gap. We found the snowman, we found the root. B flat is the root. That means this is a B flat major chord because it has a major third and a perfect fifth. A B flat major chord with an F in the bass, so it's in second inversion. What I just wrote here is what's called a lead sheet symbol with slash notation. This means it's a B flat major chord with an F in the bass. So we've seen inversion now. I'm going to discuss lead sheet symbols. Lead sheet symbols are used to analyze a chord. And a lead sheet symbol tells you a lot of information about a chord. It tells you what the root of the chord is. It tells you the quality of the chord. And sometimes, I'm going to put this in parentheses, sometimes it tells you the inversion of the chord. Usually it will. When it's in what's called slash notation, then it shows you the inversion. That's quite a bit of information, the root and the quality. There is more that we need to know about a chord eventually, but this tells us quite a bit. So let's figure out some lead sheet symbols of some chords. How about if we have, I'll do one that we can spell and recognize hopefully easily. This one. There's a G, an E, and two C's. Don't need to worry about the C. It's a C, an E, and a G. We've seen this chord enough times to hopefully recognize, just at sight, that this is a C major chord. The lead sheet symbol for a C major chord is just C. Sometimes people put the M for major, but it's redundant. If you put C, it indicates major. If it's minor, you have to put the little M. But because this is major, we don't have to do anything. If we use slash notation, this is how we would indicate the inversion. C slash G, or sometimes it's referred to as C over G. It's a C major chord with a G in the bass. So that tells you all those pieces of information. It tells you the root, it tells you the quality, and it tells you the inversion. How about these three notes? F sharp, D, and A. If I arrange those with the F sharp on the bottom and condense them, we figure out that the F sharp is not the root. We also figure out that A is not the root. There's only one left, and it's D. So we know that this is some sort of a D chord. Because it's D, F sharp, and A, it's a D major chord. So it's a D over F sharp. I'm going to go back to the first chord that I wrote here, and I'm going to turn this into an E flat, making it a C minor chord. Because it's a C minor chord now, we do have to make an adjustment in the lead sheet symbol, just a small one. Because it's C minor, I now have to put the minor. Just so you remember, I like to put the line over the M just to show that it's lowercase with a G in the bass. So these are examples of lead sheet symbols. In tonal music theory, we do use lead sheet symbols sometimes, and they're very useful, but it leaves out some important information, especially chord function. And we will get into chord function a little bit later, but before that I want to discuss another system of analysis which is somewhat similar to lead sheet symbols. And this is a very old system of analysis called bass position symbols. Or figured bass symbols. These are synonymous. They both mean the same thing. Okay, so bass position symbols. If I say BPS, I'm not referring to beats per second. I'm referring to bass position symbols. So I'm going to start with this. Bass position symbols tell you only one thing, and it seems like we may not need these when I discuss this, but you'll see in the near future why we need these. Bass position symbols only tell you intervals above the bass. That's it. That's all that the bass position symbols tell you. Now, if you know what all the intervals are above the bass in a chord, you can figure out a lot of the other information. Let me show you some bass position symbols. Here is a C major chord in first inversion. C, E, and G with the E in the bass. So it's a C major chord. The lead sheet symbol would be this. the base position symbol would be this. If you're confused, don't feel badly about it because this can be confusing. This is an abbreviation. This 6 is the way that we abbreviate first inversion triads. If we look above the base, there are 2 intervals, and this gets a little bit complicated, so I'll explain it a couple of times. We have the interval of a 1/6 from E to C. It doesn't matter what the quality of the 1/6 is, it just matters that there's a 1/6. And that's indicated here, that's what the 6 means, that there's a 6. There's also an E to a G, which, if you know your compound intervals, that's the interval of a 1/10. But we don't put 10. There's actually really not such a thing as a 10 in a base position symbol. We simplify the compound intervals. A lot of people like to read this, so I'm going to write it. Simplify compound intervals in base position symbols. So if you simplify the compound interval of a 1/10, it becomes a 1/3. This is the longhand version of the big base position symbol for a first inversion triad, 6-3. However, the 3 is a little bit redundant because it doesn't distinguish this from some of the other symbols, so we only use the 6. I'm going to leave the 6 here because this is the abbreviation. The full version would be 6-3. Let's make a nice little chart over here for base position symbols, root position, first inversion, second inversion. Still only triads. So first inversion is abbreviated with a 6. Let's turn this into a second inversion triad. So I have to flip a couple of the notes. This is now second inversion, but I haven't changed the notes, so it's still C major, C over G. Remember, this is the lead sheet symbol. This is not the base position. Base position symbols go below the staff. Lead sheet symbols go above the staff. I will be consistent with that. The abbreviation for the second inversion triad is 6-4, which is actually also the full version. There's both a 4th and a 6th in a second inversion triad. Remember, base position symbols do not indicate any sort of quality. It's just intervals above the base. It's very important that you remember that that's all that it tells you. Don't read any more into it than it tells you. It's just telling you intervals above the base. Because there's a 6 and a 4, it's telling you that there's a 4th and a 6th in this chord. Here's the 4th. Here's the 6th. They're both there. Let's rearrange the notes and make a root position C major. So this is a root position C major triad. I'm going to write the abbreviation for a root position base position symbol, and I'm done. The abbreviation for a root position base position symbol is nothing. You leave it blank. Don't write blank, just leave it blank. Root position triads are so common that you don't have to write anything. Now if we look at the full versions, these are the abbreviations. Here's going to be the full version. Full version means that it's going to explain exactly what is above the base, not abbreviated. You're going to be writing so many of these, it's just best to learn the abbreviations. The full version of a root position triad would be 5-3, because there's a 5th, and if we simplify this, there's also a 3rd. So a 5-3 chord is root position. However, if you just leave it blank, you're indicating that it's a root position triad. The full version of a first inversion is 6-3. The full version of a second inversion is the same as its abbreviation. So these do take a little bit of memorization. Root position is blank, first inversion is 6, second inversion is 6-4. If you ever hear anybody refer to something as a 6-4 chord, they're talking about a triad in second inversion. Okay, now just as you may suspect, when we add seventh chords to the equation, things get a little bit more complicated. So let's do it. Let's write a C7. And actually I'm going to erase my chart over here because this will change. Those are triad inversions. Here's going to be some seventh chord inversions. Let's start with a root position C7. C7 is the lead sheet symbol for a C dominant seventh chord. A C major triad with a minor seventh. C, E, G, and a B flat. We have the interval of a fifth. Remember, I'm looking only above the bass. We also have the interval of a third, and we have the interval of a seventh. So the full version of the bass position symbol for a root position seventh chord is 7-5-3. Bass position symbols always are vertical, and it's in numerical order with the highest number at the top. We don't write 7, 5, and 3. We abbreviate it with just 7, because the 5 and the 3 exist in a triad anyway. The 7 is what distinguishes this from the rest, so the bass position symbol would only be 7 here. If you ever see a 7, it means a root position seventh chord. That's the only one that has a 7 in it, believe it or not. Even though the rest of these inversions are going to be seventh chords, you're going to see that there's not a seventh in any of the other versions. So let's invert this seventh chord. The concept when inverting a seventh chord is exactly the same as when inverting a triad. You're just putting another member of the chord in the bass other than the root. So I'm not going to change the notes. I'm just going to change their order. E is the third in a C7 chord. The lead sheet symbol would be C7 over E. This is indicating the root, the quality, and the bass. That's what lead sheet symbols tell you. Now if we look at the intervals, we have a 6, we have a 3, and we have a 5. So different numbers than we had in the root position. So if we put this, I'm going to draw some lines here. If we put the full version over here, we'd have 6, 5, 3. Similar to the root position, but not exactly the same. It's the 6 and the 5 which distinguish this chord, and it happens to be that the 6 and the 5 are the root and the seventh. So in a 6-5 chord, a first inversion seventh chord, the 6 and the 5 are referring to the root and the seventh. So all that you need to be concerned with right now, though, is that 6-5 is the abbreviation for a first inversion seventh chord. Let's make this a second inversion seventh chord. That means I have to put the fifth in the bass, which is G. G, E flat. Let's put an E here and a C. All the members are present, but the fifth's in the bass. So that means that this is a second inversion seventh chord. We have the interval of a third, we have the interval of a sixth, and we have the interval of a fourth. So this would be 6-4-3 for the full version. The abbreviation is only the 4 and the 3. So a second inversion seventh chord is abbreviated using a bass position symbol with 4-3. Because seventh chords have one more note than triads, they also have one more inversion. If we put the seventh in the bass, this becomes third inversion. There's no such thing as a third inversion triad, but there is a third inversion of a seventh chord. So B flat in the bass, let's put an E here, Spell it like that. We have the interval of a fourth. We have the interval of a sixth. And we also have the interval of a second. This is the only one that had a second. Now it would make sense because the abbreviations are showing the distinguishing notes of each of these chords, that all we would put here is 2, because that's the only one that has a 2. But why should we make things that easy? This has become the standard abbreviation for a third version triad, 4-2. Okay. Now this looks like a big bunch of numbers, and it is. I'm going to show you a mnemonic device that you can use to remember this. Eventually, you'll be able to remember these and just be able to recognize them. But before that happens, let's write down the phone number for the BPS hotline. Area code 664 765 4342. We've become pretty accustomed to remembering phone numbers. These 10 digits are going to be easier to remember if we put it in phone number format. Hopefully you figured out what the relevance is of this phone number, but if you haven't, then let's take a look. This is first inversion triad, second inversion triad, first inversion 7th chord, second inversion 7th chord. You see where this is going. And sorry, I put this is root position. Hopefully you caught that. Root position, first inversion of 7th chords, so on and so forth, second inversion, third inversion. Just a little trick that you can use to remember these until they've really become ingrained in your memory. So if you need help with your bass position symbols, grab the phone and dial 664-765-4342. Tells you all the bass position symbols. Okay, so just a quick review. Inversions are when chords are presented with something other than the root in the bass. Triads can be in inversions. 7th chords can be in inversions. Lead sheet symbols show you the root, the quality, and the bass. That's a C minor triad with an E in the bass. If this is a minor triad with the E in the bass, which is the third, it would be a first inversion triad, so it would be abbreviated like this. Now there's one more thing that we need to talk about involving bass position symbols, because they're not quite as simple as what I've shown. Although that didn't seem so simple, but let's make it more complicated. Let's say you are looking at a piece of music in D major, and you see this chord. A C major chord in D major. It's kind of odd. If I put the lead sheet symbol up here, it's just going to be C over E. And actually I'm going to arrange this, I'm going to spell the whole chord. It was even more odd the way that I had it. Now all the members are present. We have a C, an E, and a G, with the E in the bass. We're just assuming that these are the only 3 notes. The lead sheet symbol doesn't change depending on the key. So it's really separate from the key. It's just telling you exactly at that moment how is that chord spelled. The bass position symbols are indicating intervals above the bass within the key. So since this is a first inversion triad, you would put a 6, and you'd figure that that would be it. But that's not it. Because C natural is not in the key signature, we need to make some sort of change to the base position symbol. We need to indicate that the sixth is natural, and it's the sixth that's natural. It's the interval of a sixth above the base. So you have to put a natural sign there. If it was sharp and it becomes natural, you have to put a natural. If it was natural and it became sharp, you have to put a sharp. Let's now imagine that you're in B minor and you see this chord. Actually, a quite common chord in B minor. This is an F sharp major chord. Remember, this is an F sharp and this is a C sharp because of the key signature. That would be the lead sheet symbol. It doesn't say anything about that extra A sharp that's in there. Remember, the base position symbol for a root position triad is just blank. I can't leave this blank though, because there's a note that's outside of the key signature. Notes that are outside of the key signature must be indicated in the figured base. Let me write that because that's pretty important. Notes outside the key signature must be indicated. In the figured base. When I say figured base, you'd probably notice that I use figure base and base position symbols pretty much evenly. I don't really prefer one or the other. They both mean the same thing. So they must be indicated in the figured base. Now, if we leave this blank, how do we indicate it in the figured base? Like that. Whoa, wait, hold the phone. What is that sharp attached to? Well, if you put an accidental out there by itself in the figured base, it is referring to the third above the base. Because remember, this would be the figured base if we put the full version of a root position triad, 5, 3. 3's on the bottom. If you just put a sharp, it's telling you that the third is sharp above the base. Base position symbols are indicating the position of the notes above the base. What if I add an E to this chord and turn it into an F sharp 7? This would be the base position symbol. The 7 is the base position symbol for a root position 7th chord. The sharp is referring to the third above the base. If you ever see an accidental by itself in a base position symbol, it is referring to the third above the base. Always. Any other members of the base position symbol must be indicated with their numbers. And you will see a lot of different versions of this. I showed you the natural next to the 6. Sometimes if there's a sharp above the 6, you'll see it like this. If there's ever a slash through a note, or a number I mean, that means that this is raised by a half step. These mean the same thing if it went from a natural to a sharp. So slash indicates raised by a half step. Four sometimes looks like this when it's raised by a half step. That little arm on the 4 has a line through it. But if you ever saw a 4 with a slash through it, it would mean the same thing. You probably won't see that, but if you ever did, you know that the slash means that it's raised by a half step. If there's a 2 with a slash through it, it means that the second above the base is raised by a half step. It makes sense, just as long as you remember that the slash means raised by a half step. That's all that you need to remember, is that these are indicating notes that are outside of the key signature. And it's only notes outside the key signature. Doesn't just mean that they're sharp or flat. If it's a C sharp, that's a sixth above the bass, but there's a C sharp in the key signature, you don't have to indicate that because it's in the key signature. Okay? So take some time. If this was complicated, you have plenty of time here at the beginning of the semester. Hopefully you're watching this at the beginning of the semester. Just go back and watch this a few times. Check in your book, because this can be a little bit of a complicated subject when you're first dealing with it. But once you grasp this, it will make your music theory of life so much easier, because we're going to be running across different versions of bass position symbols from here all the way to the end of the 4th semester. So have fun reviewing your bass position symbols.